Morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Rabbi, gentlemen.
Okay, I would like us to just continue a couple of more paragraphs in Rav Kook in his discussion of vegetarianism as being the ideal for the Messianic age, even though it's not something that is universally embraced today. But what Rav Kook was noting is that as mankind evolves, mankind is moving closer towards a perfected state. And in that perfected state, that messianic state, man will no longer have to uh, feed himself by spilling in animals' blood. And
Rabbi, before we get into the detail, can I just ask one question about that direction? Has
yeah.
it not also been said that the further we are from Matan Torah, the further we are developed? And I'm not sure how that sort of fits and changes to the improvement aspect.
Well, okay, so it's a very good question, Paul. There's a principle called Nitkatnu Hadorot, that the generations have diminished as we move further away from Matan Torah. That is a discussion about the ability for any given generation to have a proper appreciation in wisdom for the teachings of the Torah. And but at the same time, the rabbis say that every succeeding generation builds upon the scholarship of the prior generation, so that we are like dwarves on the shoulders of giants. So that there is a continuous evolutionary process taking place within civilization that builds upon the previous generation. And that's why not only Rav Kook, but so many Jewish thinkers describe the Messianic age as an evolutionary process that builds upon all of the progress that we have made spiritually over the millennia. Okay, so it's not there is a Gemara that says that the Messiah will come either in a generation that is completely righteous or a generation that is completely depraved. And both, in a sense, can be accurate in the sense that mankind may actually evolve socially and morally, but at the same time, it can be completely depraved in other areas. To consider, for example, what's happening in our own generation, that mankind has evolved beyond racism, beyond misogyny, beyond discrimination of any kind, but it's come at the expense of what? Of sexual depravity. Okay, so that there's a sense of complete sexual abandon where man feels that he's permitted to do whatever his soul desires, and man does not feel in any sense a sense of shame or hiding from God. Man is not even clear if he believes in God anymore, and but at the same time, there is a moral evolutionary process that we are going through. We're not there yet. We're certainly not at a place where even the most liberated and developed, what they call woke culture. You've heard of that term? Even the most woke individual is very, very flawed and still discriminates and still hates and that's the problem. The problem with society today is that people position themselves as being extremely elevated in their thinking and in their attitudes, when in reality they're just as prejudiced against their fellow man, but just in a different way. Right? So instead of being prejudiced against black people or being prejudiced against women, they're prejudiced against men, or they're prejudiced against white people. So everyone still has their prejudices. It's just that we're starting to realize that prejudices are wrong, and hatred is wrong. But we definitely have a long way to go.
That's helpful, Rabbi. And I guess what we're saying is that we're evolving, but each step is getting smaller. Like the steps are baby steps on top of the giants, but it's still moving upwards. Is that a good way to think about it?
Yeah, it is a good way to think about it. Although there is, I forget, there's a philosophical model. I forget, was it Euripides or someone of the ancient Greek thinkers who talked about if you keep having the amount that you travel every day, then mathematically you'll never reach your destination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? Because so we have to be careful to understand that we're not having every generation, we're not having the progress. We're still constantly making progress that has a cumulative effect.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, sure. So we have this concept of lo dibra Torah ela keneged hayetzer hara, that this many times the Torah addresses the Yetzer Hara. And what do we mean by the Torah addressing the Yetzer Hara? Is that there are certain necessary evils that the Torah needs to make allowances for. So why? Because the Torah is speaking to a flawed society and a flawed individual. And as such, the Torah makes concessions to those flawed human beings. So perfect example that you'll find many times. Yesterday we talked about the Torah permitting warfare, even though warfare is a horrible thing. It involves bloodshed, killing human beings. And the Torah says that when you do go to war, because when you come into the land of Canaan, don't think that they're just going to give you the keys to the land. You're going to have to fight for it. That's the way of the world. And God's not going to create supernatural miracles. He'll create natural miracles. So perforce, you're going to have to fashion tools of war for yourselves. You're going to have to get your hands bloody, and you're going to have to kill people in order to be able to conquer the land. But here's what you need to do in the course of land conquest of the land of Eretz Yisrael, is that you're going to have to be compassionate in war. And here are the rules of war, so that you don't become cruel and wantonly violent, gratuitously violent in the process. Another example is the mitzvah of slavery. This is one of the biggest arguments that atheists make against against the Torah and try to debunk it. They say, you mean, anytime a person puts forth an argument about morality coming from the Torah, they'll say, oh, you mean so the Torah or the Bible espouses morality? I'll have to remember that next time I acquire a slave for myself. So the fallacy of that argument, what's the fallacy of the argument? Can anyone tell me?
I guess how we treat slaves according to the Torah.
The Torah it's even more fundamental than that. The Torah is not commanding you to own slaves. The Torah is telling you that slavery is a reality of your civilization. And if you are going to own slaves, because that's a concession to the economy in which you live, where slaves are just like today, certain forms of labor are a basic reality in order to run society, right? We need people to, let's say a generation ago, there were jobs where your entire job was underground right? That those jobs still exist. They're not as prevalent anymore, but the life of a coal miner is a very abysmal life, because you're spending your whole day underground. Sometimes the mine can collapse. Sometimes you can get what's called miner's lung or coal lung, and get very, very sick as a result of the mining. But that's a reality, because if coal is the source of fuel that runs our economy, you can't automatically say in the course of 5 minutes that today our economy runs on coal and tomorrow we're shutting down all the coal mines, right? And the same thing is true, is that as civilization progresses, the Bible, the Torah could not shut down the institution of slavery. It was not God's will for the Jewish people to eliminate their entire economic structure of the world that was around them. But the Torah says slavery is a concession to the Yetzer Hara. It's a necessary evil. And here's what you need to do in order to treat your slaves as compassionately as possible and not to exploit them or treat them badly. And there are countless examples of this in the Torah. Okay, so Another example of this, Rav Kook says, is the permission granted to Noah after he gets off the teva, off the ark. Permission is granted to him to eat animals. So this too is a necessary evil, because man, God recognizing that the conditions after the flood are such that in order for man not to repeat the same criminal things that he did in the past, God is going to have to alter man's physical constitution and allow him to eat certain proteins that are only obtainable from animal life in order for him to sustain himself. God says in order for the human being to remain healthy, he needs to be able to eat meat. And when I say healthy, I mean both physically healthy and spiritually healthy. And Rav Kook runs through in the ensuing chapters a number of different arguments as to why the Torah needed to create this domination that man has over animals to the point of eating them in order to satisfy man's bloodlust. This was one way of channeling man's bloodlust by allowing him to consume animals instead of killing human beings. Another argument, Rav Kook makes several arguments. One argument that he makes is that if man had complete parity with animals, then man might learn the improper lessons from animals, because animals today behave like animals, and God doesn't want human beings to behave like animals. He therefore wants the human being to look at animals as being subhuman, as being less than, as being completely under our domination, because they are stupid animals who don't know the right thing to do. And we human beings are very, very different from animals. And in chapter 11, he writes as follows. He says, Afgam Zos, can everyone see it? I hope you can see it. Lu hayu chavot hamusar nohagim b'shefa bein ha'adam leba'alei chayim gam bizman heder hashlemut hamusarit. He says, if there was this complete sense of morals and ethics that human beings behaved toward, that there was this sense that a human being had a moral imperative to behave compassionately towards animals on a complete level, even when man is not fully developed morally. Hayugormim ra'ot rabot. This would cause great evils. V'ikuv hitpatchut l'musar ha'enoshi, and it would actually hamper man's ability to develop and evolve morally. Gam mitzad acher, for the reason that I'm about to explain. Ki hinei regesh hatov v'hayashar sheba'adam mevakesh tafkido. He says, because there's an instinct within man that is constantly seeking to do the right thing, to fulfill his purpose. V'hu hadofek gam ken lefa'amim al dalte lev rish'ei aretz. That instinct, or that inner voice that calls upon man to do the right thing, is also sometimes within the mind of an evil person. Okay, and you're going to see this is so prophetic of Rav Kook, as you'll see in just a second. Umecharchim levakesh bameh lahashkit et ra'avon hatzedek hativi shelahem. And therefore, even evil people who really are malicious and evil and petty and spiteful and racist and prejudiced in their hearts are always looking for a way to satisfy that inner voice that calls out to them to be compassionate and kind and merciful and so forth. Yesod koach hateshuka she'imameret et ha'olam, because that, after all, is that inner instinct within man is the thing that keeps the world standing. V'lif'amim timtza rasha aritz bocher lo inyan musari v'sas la'asot tzedek. And therefore you find a particularly evil person who chooses to act morally, and he rejoices when he finds an opportunity to behave righteously. Kidei lahashkit bazeh musar kilyotav v'hanacham hativi hamefa'im b'kirbo. In order to silence that inner voice and instinct that is calling out to him to do good. V'im hahit chasdut im ba'alei chayim hayta meforsemet l'chefetz shel tzedakah kevua b'min ha'enoshi. And if there was a moral imperative within society to behave kindly with animals, and that was something that was prevalent within society, וזאת הייתה בהכרח באה עם סידור החיובים המוסריים נגדם. And there was this clarion call within society to behave with certain kinds of, in certain kinds of ways with animals. Afilu im hayu rak ba'ofan shlili, az hayinu pogshim hamon gadol shel rish'ei tevel. He says, even if it was in a very superficial way, but there was still a call for compassion to animals, what we would encounter would be very evil people, hameshachrim l'teref kize'evei erev, who in their hearts really wish to lash out at humanity like wolves in the night, zovchei adam be'ein chemla, exterminating human beings with complete discompassion, umusar kilyoteim k'shay me'ik lahem hayu mimal'im berucha al yedei chasidutim ba'alei chayim. And whenever they would feel that tinge or that pang of guilt and a desire to behave compassionately, instead of carrying that out with their fellow human being, they would carry it out with animals. Okay, she'ein biyachsam otana sibot hagarmot lipshaim shel shilton ha'adam ba'adam l'ralo. And they would be able to channel all of the instinct for compassion upon animals, because that way, because the thing that calls upon them to act maliciously with their fellow human being does not exist. In other words, whatever reason they may have for wishing to destroy their fellow human being would not necessarily be prevalent in their desire to be kind to animals. Habaot l'rov b'sibat sina kina b'chayotze bahem, because as we know, when are people hateful of their fellow human beings? Oftentimes it's out of jealousy, and that jealousy doesn't exist with animals. And therefore, if there was such a prevalent attitude of compassion towards animals in a pre-messianic society, mankind could delude himself into thinking that I am a good person even though I'm slaughtering human beings, because look at how I treat animals. As after all, we know that animals are not a threat to human beings in the sense that they aren't competing for the same successes as human beings are. Chochmat ha'adam lahara mutzeit kan kar nirchav l'sachsech et hadeot v'habikoret shehi mevakeret mumin. So he says, and the wisdom, man's cunning to do evil would find a very soft cushion in order to assuage his guilty conscience. שהייתה מצגת את הכללים שתמצא באדם, מה שאין דוגמתם בבעלי חיים כלל, הייתה מחזקת ידי מרעים כאלה ואין ערוך לכל המהומה, המגרעת והמצוקה, עינוי הדין ועיוות המשפט שהיו מוצאים לרגלי הסכמות מפורסמות כאלה. In other words, this channel for compassion that would exist in animals would only actually intensify man's malice and hateful behavior towards his fellow human being, because what would normally hold a person back from behaving in from committing atrocities towards his fellow human being would be that pang of guilt. But that pang of guilt could be alleviated and assuaged by his compassion towards animals. And therefore, it would only actually result in a much worse acting out of man against his fellow man. Al kain ra'ata haskama elokit shiraki yechola lasul mitzilot bekerev kilayot v'leiv lenateket petil hachibor bein adam lebalei chayim leman yitrakez merkaz hamusari ha'anashi betovato ha'miyuchedet. And that's why God saw it fit to remove from civilization this clarion call for compassion to animals, so that man could focus instead on having compassion to his fellow human being. And that would create the proper pathway to arrive at a messianic age. Because if we put if we call for compassion to animals, it'll only act as a distraction to channel man's instinct for goodness, and it'll allow man to delude himself into thinking that he's a good person when he's actually really a horrible human being towards his fellow human being. So where did we see this the most? We saw this in Nazi Germany, where there was a huge movement in Nazi Germany for compassion towards animals, towards dogs and cats and things like that. And at the same time, where there was this whole SPCA movement in Germany, there was at the same time this depiction of Jews as even less than animals, as vermin, as rats, and that allowed Nazis to make themselves think that they were being good people, and they would routinely exterminate not only Jews but also anyone who was considered to be subhuman, people with mental illness, people who were mentally disabled. They would routinely kill these people, and they would assuage their guilt by saying, "But look how compassionate we are to good animals, right? Not people who are a pox on mankind, but rather look how we get along with our dogs, and how the humane society that we've set up." Okay, so therefore,
In fact, I think the leader was vegetarian.
Who, Hitler?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay, but that would make sense. And so in other words, we have to be very, very careful with these kinds of movements, and because saving the whales or PETA and all of these movements of compassion to animals can act as a very unhealthy distraction from compassion to human beings. And that's always been the problem in our lifetimes, about people who are unbalanced in the way that they prioritize animals over human beings. That's generally speaking the same people who are at the forefront of movements to help animals, who are also at the forefront of other liberal movements that call for abortion and justify euthanasia, and don't have a very high regard to the infinite value of human life. Okay, and so this is a very important argument that Rav Kook makes, and so Rav Kook himself is not calling upon his fellow Jew to be vegetarian, but he's telling his fellow Jew that if you as an individual find yourself in a position where you have advanced to the point where you feel compassion for animals because you're so developed that not only have you mastered compassion towards humans, you're ready to go in and you feel such sensitivity towards all living beings, then more power to you. But he's not calling upon society to get to that point, because he clearly recognizes that we're not there. And okay, so he then says in chapter 12, Uvavo ha'enoshut lematarat ashera b'chufsha ha'shalem b'vo'a ad marom piskata hashlama shel dat elokim tzerufa el kedushat ha'chayim hamelim b'tzivyonam. It says, when mankind reaches the apex of his humanity, when he reaches that sense of perfection and completion, az yagia tor he'arat ha'seichel shehu kibinyan nosad al he'arat ha'torah shekadma lichlal ha'enoshut. Then man will reach a new level of awareness. And this level of awareness is beyond the awareness of the Torah. What he calls he'arat ha'torah is an awareness that is triggered by the Torah's teachings, and there will be something beyond the Torah's teachings, which he calls he'arat ha'seichel, an intellectual awakening or an awareness that will come to man that builds on top of the Torah. V'yakir az ha'adam et yachaso el chaverav b'yitzira. Then man at that point will recognize his relationship to all of his fellow creatures that have been created in this world. Ba'alei ha'chayim kulam, all living creatures. Eichu ra'ui lihiyot mitzad ha'musar ha'ta'or, she'eino nizkak od leviturim shel dochak, man will come to the realization, because he will have reached the ultimate moral code that is not looking for shortcuts or excuses. In other words, up until now, we live moral lives with concessions, moral lives with an asterisk, okay? And the moral living with an asterisk is, yes, I'm a moral person, but I kill animals, okay, for food, right? So that asterisk will be eliminated, and so I can live completely morally. Litzir shel midat rachamim imidat hadin leviturim, shelo dibra bahem Torah ela keneged yetzer hara. And as we explained before, that instead of trying to balance one's compassion with one's sternness, and make concessions, as we know that the Torah addresses the Yetzer Hara and makes concessions to it, ki im lalechet bo'orach tov muchlat, but man will reach a point where he's going to be completely good. V'charati lahem berit bayom hahu im chayat hasadeh v'of hashamayim v'remes ha'adama, as the verse says, I will make a covenant on that day with the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens and those animals that creep on the earth. The keshet v'cherev u'milchama eshbor min haaretz, and I will destroy. We did this yesterday, and I will destroy all tools of war. Okay, and so I think there was one more chapter I wanted you to look at. Just give me. I'm fast forwarding ahead, because there's a lot that he has to say about this.
Rabbi, while you're searching there, just a quick question there. For many of us, we get tremendous joy of taking a nice steak off the grill and eating it and being satiated and thanking Hashem for this beautiful meal. But it seems to me that we should be doing this with almost some sadness. I mean, what should be our mindset when we're eating like that?
Well, there are different levels of awareness, Ron. If a person can come to a level of appreciation to the Ribono Shel Olam for giving him this bountiful meal, that in itself is a certain great level of awareness. But it's not the level that Rav Kook was on. Rav Kook was on an even higher level. His level was that I have gratitude to Hashem for giving me a beautiful world, but part of that world is that there are other living creatures in this world other than myself, and I'm sensitized to the fact that there is life beating within them, and I don't want to take their life. So we're not on that level today. Some people are, but that's not where we are yet. Listen, I enjoy a good steak just as much as the next guy, right? And no one is advocating. I'm not advocating that people become vegetarians, but what I would like to observe is that the world is moving in that direction. I can't tell you the amount of veganism and vegetarianism that is in the world today is multiple times more than what it was even just a decade ago. All of these meat substitutes. And actually, the reason why I became aware of this text of Rav Kook is because a couple of years ago, I gave a shiur on lab-produced meat. And that is where I feel we are headed. And Israel is one of the countries that is involved in advancing this technology of creating meat protein out of algae, without having to kill animals. And there are so many benefits to it. There are going to be health benefits to humans. There's going to be ecological benefits to the environment, because there's a toll on the environment when you do all of this factory farming, where you have to produce so many cattle and so many pigs and so many birds in order to feed society. It takes a great toll on land, on the soil as well, and there's a huge amount of waste that is taking place. So the world is definitely headed in the right direction, but we have to make sure that we don't make that our our priority, a Jew or a non-Jew who makes that his or her priority in life is, again, going to end up behaving cruelly to human beings because they are so fixated on compassion to animals. And we have to be very, very careful about not putting the cart before the horse and being very deliberate and methodical in the way that we advance morally ourselves. So I want you to enjoy that steak, really, really enjoy it. But then after you finish your steak and your belly is full, I want you to consider to yourself, one day, could I see myself having a really good and plentiful and tasty meal without having to have killed an animal in the process? And that's that's what you should be left with, is not, of course you should say the bracha to Hashem. And by the way, you should also be thinking to yourself in, like Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi said to the calf. Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi was right. The calf was brought into the world for the sake of being slaughtered. The highest contribution that a cow can make is to have its meat placed on a Shabbos table and have a bracha recited over it on the holy Shabbos. And the Arizal used to say that certain people get reincarnated into animals so that if a bracha is recited over their flesh, their soul gets elevated. So there is something to be said about that. So at the present time when we do eat animals, we should be elevating the flesh of those animals by consuming them in a state of mental devotion to God, in a state of purity and holiness, with the proper attitude that I'm eating in order to serve Hashem, right? I'm eating to live and not living to eat, etc., etc. And that's in itself a great thing. But there's a higher level, and that's what Rav Kook is talking about here. Okay, we'll hold it for today. We're off for tomorrow, and we'll see you, Mitzvah Hashem, on Monday. Okay? So everyone
Very well
have a good
put, Rabbi. Shkoyach.